Pixels to polygons, simple to systematic, indefinite to detailed. The faces we see on video game characters have gone from basically up to your imagination to accurate material, skin, and hair simulations. And today gameranx wants to take you on a little trip through the evolution of facial animation in video games. So way back in 1980, before even I was born, that's right, old Falcon's a millennial. You did know that's the cutoff point, right? 1980? And if you include the year 1980, you might be surprised to find out that Pac-Man is actually a millennial as well. That little yellow pizza with a missing slice is also pretty much the first example of, dare I say it, detailed facial animation in a video game. Now, obviously, to call Pac-Man's facial animation detailed, you have to broaden your idea of what detailed is for a moment. But you also have to remember, we're trying to go back as far as we can. Before Pac-Man, there really wasn't anything that you could even call facial animation. It's not as though he had an incredibly detailed set of expressions that he gracefully transitioned between, or anything like that. He just used more than one frame to change expressions. His range of expressions was pretty limited and included open mouth and shut mouth, but for the time it actually was very smooth animation, at least for a video game. Slightly more detailed but less smooth a year later was Donkey Kong. Now, Donkey Kong didn't really have any transitional frames in his face, but depending on what actions he would take, he had very different facial expressions, pretty detailed ones considering the low resolution. You knew what Donkey Kong was thinking as he lobbed those barrels. You knew the frustration that he felt. He was obviously a gorilla, but he was also just a squirrel trying to get a nut. I'm going to allow you to contemplate that for a moment, and then think about what Donkey Kong actually is. Oh yeah, you figured it out, didn't you? It's a horny gorilla. I guess it's probably better that frustration's really kind of the only thing we saw of Donkey Kong, right? It's a good thing we aren't seriously entertaining the idea of an animated O-face on a monkey in 1981. But for the rest of the 1980s, the believability of a character's face was generally kind of left up to the player. Essentially, games like Legend of Zelda and Super Mario Bros. Didn't really give you facial animation per se. They kind of gave you a pretty blank-looking face and kind of left the human subconscious to fill in the blanks. In a way, video game characters' faces were slightly abstract art. On account, abstract art depends upon the outlook of those viewing the art to give the art meaning. In the era of very low detailed games, this was generally the right thing to do. In a game like Legend of Zelda, your character is very small, one tile of the game in size. You don't really want to occupy the screen with a large amount of face. It would probably look pretty weird. But every once in a while you would have a game like 1987's Mike Tyson's Punch-Out!, where the developers were provided an opportunity to have a larger character on the screen and give different facial expressions. All things considered, Mike Tyson's Punch-Out! Probably has the most detailed facial animation of any video game in the 1980s. Considering that's an entire decade of gaming, that's actually pretty impressive. And if you look back, obviously now the games of the 1980s, especially the 8-bit games of the 1980s, are looked back as retro now, or even quaint or kitschy, depending on what region of the world you're from. You have to consider that nothing like that had ever existed. The Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years. The concept of a face is relatively new, let alone the concept of facial animation in video games. So let's take a moment and recognize the important steps that were taken in the 1980s to define exactly what a video game could even be. We wouldn't be talking about things like the uncanny valley today, which represents the difference between our incredibly detailed simulations of the world and the actual world. If technology hadn't existed, that frankly looks like crap compared to what we see now. Obviously, we aren't talking about massive advances at this point because we're really looking at tiny sprites still. But a notable advance, I would say, came in the form of Sonic the Hedgehog in 1991. If you let Sonic alone for a while, he'd get impatient. He'd stand there and he'd tap his foot and he'd look at the player like, you gonna do anything? You gonna go on? You're playing this game for real, right? You didn't just turn it on and walk away, did you? visibly irritated by the fact that he had to wait for the player. The following year in 1992, a game called Wolfenstein 3D came out. Now, there is a massive amount of technological advances as well as advances in the paradigm itself, but focusing just on faces in the game, they featured a face showing what your face was doing, supposedly, in-game at all time. The Wolfenstein guy's face reflected how much damage you had. He sort of peered around and appeared to be animated and full of life in a way that maybe you wouldn't expect. In 1993, Doom, basically the successor to Wolfenstein 3D, expanded on a lot of engine ideas, from texture mapping to surfaces being different heights, etc. But they also went in and made the Doom Marine's facial expressions even more expressive. He reflected damage still, but he also got pretty aggressive sometimes, which was neat. It was cool to have your in-game avatar sort of representing what you might feel at the time, at least what you would feel in sync to what's going on in the game. Given the relatively small capabilities of machines at the time, both console and PC, that's kind of about as far as it got. That all changed, however, with the PlayStation and the Nintendo 64. It's actually their mascots, their flagship characters, that kind of did it too. When you first pop in the Super Mario 64 cartridge, you're greeted with Mario, and he's like, "Yeah, I'm Mario. Check it out. I'm a fully animated polygon face. My eyes are fully functional. My ears move. I can smile. I can talk a little. Oh, and you can manipulate my face with a cursor if you are so inclined." The jump in technology that was made for facial animation in video games that happened between 2D games and Super Mario 64 is astounding. Now, Mario had a few in-game facial expressions, but generally stayed pretty static. A game that came out just a few months after Mario 64, Crash Bandicoot, was not that way. Crash actually would constantly change facial expression, to the point where it was actually amusing. I was amused by Crash Bandicoot in the way that I was often amused by cartoons at the time, and that very much turned me on to PlayStation, because technically it was a less powerful machine. Why would you want the less powerful machine? Well, obviously, just because the graphics aren't quite as good doesn't mean the games aren't. And believe it or not, that little thing was actually what told my kid brain, hey, it's okay to like the less powerful machine. About having fun, right? And believe it or not, things like Crash Bandicoot's facial animation actually made me consider that idea. In 1998, Half-Life came out, and Half-Life did a lot of very different things, especially in the first-person shooting genre, where when you went back a few years, the only facial animation was that of a sprite depicting what was going on the face of the player character. Pretty much everybody had various expressions, not anything too astounding, but everybody talked in a manner that actually changed the polygons on people's faces. Mouths were actual holes. That same year, Metal Gear Solid came out, and it contained sprite animation that happened in dialogue moments where you went into the codec and spoke to other characters. This was probably one of the last mainstream uses of 2D graphics to depict what was going on people's faces, on account technology was about to rapidly progress. Over the next few years, we'd see evolution from titles like Conker's Bad Fur Day, Max Payne, Final Fantasy X, and probably one of my favorite titles of the time, Metal Gear Solid 2: Sons of Liberty, and games that would just employ various techniques to show us exactly what was going on inside a person by showing us subtle changes in their facial expressions. In a way, the title screen to Mario 64 in 1996 kind of served as a tech demo for the next 8 or 9 years worth of facial animation in video games. Obviously, in actual gameplay, generally nothing looked as detailed or interesting or animated as that title screen, but everything was sort of working its way to that point. And by 2004, nearly a decade later, Valve, the creators of Half-Life, had come up with something that was the next huge step in facial animation in video games. Where Half-Life 1, which by all accounts, like I said, a landmark title in video games, ran on a highly modified version of the Quake engine, Half-Life 2 was being developed on entirely proprietary technology that Valve had been working on for quite a long time. In 2004, when Half-Life 2 came out, it was our first official interaction with the Source engine. Now, why this is so important is the source engine has a very specific facial animation system inside it. You could easily rig a character model that you had created with a movable face in a way that allowed you to manipulate the face in an incredibly easy way and standardize the facial animation for all the characters. No longer did it have to be, okay, you make the smile for this character, now make the smile for this character and this character. You could apply the same action to an internal structure that simply manipulated every single one of these models in the same way. And what this did was change the amount of work that had to be done in order to make all the characters animated, specifically in the face. These types of techniques were adopted by almost everybody almost immediately, and many games from that point forward used this kind of rigged animation system for faces as well as basically the entire body. And I know that Half-Life and the Source engine aren't the absolute first instance of using a rig in order to create animation, but in video games it is most certainly the most noticeable, the most notable, and the title that did the most to popularize the technique. A lot of different games used a lot of different experiments on other ways to do it as well over the next few years, but generally it sort of stuck to that, or at least variations on that. However, a game came out in 2011 that pushed the boundaries so much further than anybody had on what could be done on a face, and did it in a way that nobody really has attempted to do again since, and that's L.A. Noire. Now, the way the facial animation was accomplished in L.A. Noire was actors sat down with a bunch of high-definition cameras strapped to their face and acted out all these scenes. Animated maps were created from these cameras and mapped onto polygons in-game that replicated the performances. The result is an incredibly detailed style of animation that in all honesty was rather astounding, but at the same time it was also a little strange looking, being that everyone's face was kind of constructed in a manner that was based on capturing an image of an actual face doing all of the things and mapping it onto something that didn't look entirely real. The game looked a little strange too. That's not to detract from it. At the time, this is the absolute pinnacle of facial animation, and there's nothing you can say to contradict that I think would be valid. That being said, the fact that the game was a stylized, polygonal, almost cartoon with these hyper-realistic face textures, and also combining the fact that the hardware of the time wasn't necessarily creating realistic lighting, at least in the way it's done now, it could produce some rather strange results. It was impressive and it was cool, but it also kind of taught a little bit of a lesson, and that is that until we actually can synthesize reality, it doesn't really make sense to try and place real things into an unreal world. To bring up the uncanny valley again, L.A. Noire was not just the pinnacle of facial animation for the time, it was also peak uncanny valley. All of the times that motion capture had been applied to a face culminated in and created kind of maybe a little bit of an awkward, not quite one-to-one representation, culminated in L.A. Noire. And the lesson learned is maybe that it doesn't hurt to not attempt photorealism in the face. Some element of stylization really should be present in art. You know, style. And that was only 5 years ago. Isn't that weird to think about? Games look infinitely better now. And I think L.A. Noire actually directed a lot of that, in that people understood the necessity for very realistic animation, but when you try too hard to look real, it ends up not looking real. And to that effect, you saw more games like The Last of Us, Tomb Raider, and BioShock Infinite, where the real effort was put into how people moved rather than how realistic they looked. The techniques that are in place are actually not that different than they were in 2004 with the Source engine. They create people and then rig them in various ways, bone systems and muscle systems, to implement a way to animate them, and in some cases they're motion captured. Facial capture is now done in a way that can be tracked much more accurately, and that animation can be put onto a character without it looking super weird, but really that kind of entirely hinges on hardware evolving and making it possible to show more polygons and light them more realistically. A lot of what we attribute to people getting better at animating faces is actually just technological advances that may not even have anything to do with facial animation. Just the game itself looking better can make the facial animation look better in context. Uncharted 4 just came out, and believe it or not, they actually use the facial capture as a basis, doing a great deal of the animation by hand. And in my opinion, this is the best case you could possibly make for doing all of these types of things by hand. Not worrying about them being realistic, but rather worrying about them being stylistic. Yes, rigging systems are used in order to do the facial animation. In fact, Naughty Dog is saying that over 300 to 400 bones are implemented in each one of the characters' faces. But when you're not worrying about being entirely true to the performance, when your goal is really just to start there and from there move into a much more context-sensitive style of animation that suits the world it's in, I think it just looks much better. And again, until we can synthesize reality itself, I don't think there's a good reason not to be treating facial animation as art. Going forward, I'm sure that there's going to be a lot of times when people use facial capture in a way that looks great, but I'll be honest with you, I think an artist's eye for what looks right in an in-game world is going to produce the best facial animation going forward, at least for quite a while. What do you think? Let's meet in the comments and have a conversation about that. If you enjoyed this video, please click the like button. And if you're not subscribed, now is a great time to do so, as we upload brand new videos every single day of the week, and the best way to see them first is of course a subscription. As always, we thank you so much for watching this video, and we will see you next time right here on gameranx.